There are cases that stay with you, cases that settle somewhere in the back of your mind and refuse to leave. This is one of them. When Richard Palmer walked into my office that Thursday afternoon, I noticed something strange before he even sat down. He was smiling, not the polite social smile people wear to mask discomfort, not the nervous smile of someone entering a therapist's office for the first time. This was something else entirely. Something that didn't match the story he was about to tell me. He sat down slowly, crossed his legs, and looked around my office with what I can only describe as peaceful curiosity, like a man who had just returned from a long vacation, like someone who had finally set down a weight he'd been carrying for decades. "Dr. Marchetti," he said, "I need you to help me understand something." I nodded, waiting. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a lawyer's office in Connecticut. My father had just died. Heart attack, 72 years old. He paused, but his expression didn't change. The lawyer read the will. Everything: the house, the investments, the business. Every single penny my father had accumulated over 50 years of work went to my stepmother. I was left with nothing. Not a photograph, not a watch, not even a mention. I watched his face carefully. In 26 years of practice, I've learned to read the micro-expressions that betray what people are really feeling. Grief, anger, betrayal, shock. These are the emotions you expect when someone tells you they've been completely disinherited by their own father. But Richard Palmer showed none of these. Instead, he smiled again, that same peaceful, almost serene smile. "And here's the part I can't explain," he continued. "When the lawyer finished reading, when my stepmother looked at me with that smug expression she's worn for 20 years, when my half-siblings avoided my eyes, I felt relief, pure, overwhelming relief. Like a chain I didn't know existed had finally been cut." He leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Marchetti, I should be devastated. I should be hiring lawyers to contest the will. I should be furious, but I'm not. I'm free, and I need to understand why." That was the moment I knew this case would be different, because the question Richard Palmer was asking wasn't about grief or inheritance or family dynamics. The question he was really asking was far more profound. Why did losing everything feel like gaining everything? And what we discovered in the regression, well, that changed how I understand the weight we carry from one life to the next. Richard Palmer was 47 years old when he walked into my office. A financial analyst based in Boston, he had the kind of measured, analytical demeanor you'd expect from someone who spent their days examining numbers and projections. Tall, with brown hair just starting to gray at the temples, he spoke with precision and clarity. But there was something beneath that composed exterior, something that had been there long before his father's death. "Tell me about your relationship with your father," I said during our first session. Richard was quiet for a moment. Complicated. That's the word everyone uses, isn't it? But it was more than complicated. It was ... absent. Even when he was physically present. He explained that his parents had divorced when he was 8 years old. His mother had raised him alone in a small apartment in Rhode Island, while his father, William Palmer, had remarried within a year and started a new family in Connecticut. A bigger house, better schools for his new children. Vacations to Europe that Richard only heard about through photographs. He sent checks, Richard said, child support, birthday cards with money inside. But he never came to my baseball games. Never showed up for graduations. I was an obligation, not a son. What struck me was how Richard spoke about this without bitterness. There was a detachment in his voice, as if he were describing events that had happened to someone else. "When did you last see him?" I asked. 4 months before he died. I drove up to Connecticut for his 70th birthday. My stepmother, Helen, organized a big party, 70 guests, catered food, a band." He paused. "I stood in the corner most of the night. My father spoke to me for maybe 10 minutes total. Asked about my work, nodded at my answers. Then someone else caught his attention, and he walked away." "How did that make you feel?" Richard considered the question carefully. "It should have hurt. I know that, but honestly I felt nothing. I've felt nothing about my father for as long as I can remember, and that's what confuses me. because the moment I heard I'd been disinherited completely, deliberately excluded from his will, I felt something for the first time in decades. I felt free. He looked at me with genuine confusion in his eyes. Why would being erased by my father feel like liberation? Over the following sessions, we explored Richard's childhood in greater depth. His mother, Eleanor, had been a devoted parent who worked 2 jobs to provide for him. She never spoke badly about his father, but Richard could read between the lines. The tight-lipped silence when birthday cards arrived without phone calls. The extra shifts she picked up whenever William missed a child support payment. She died when I was 32, Richard told me. Cancer. I was holding her hand at the end. She looked at me and said something strange. She said, "You were always meant to be mine. Only mine. Remember that?" What did you think she meant? I assumed she was talking about the divorce, about how I'd grown up with her, not with him, but lately, ... double quotes, he trailed off. Lately I've been wondering if she meant something else entirely. Richard described recurring dreams that had plagued him since childhood. In these dreams, he was always in a dark, cold space, sometimes a cellar, sometimes a cave, sometimes a room with stone walls. He could never move, couldn't speak, could only wait in the darkness while someone paced overhead, footsteps echoing like a countdown. "I've had that dream hundreds of times," he said. "Always the same feeling. That I'm waiting for something. That someone has the power to release me but chooses not to. And the strangest part, I'm not afraid. I'm angry. Deeply, furiously angry. At whom?" Richard shook his head. "That's what I can never figure out. In the dream, I don't know who's walking above me. I just know that they could help. And they won't." The parallels were too clear to ignore. A father who had the power to include his son in his life, but chose not to. A will that could have acknowledged Richard's existence, but deliberately excluded him. A lifetime of waiting in darkness for acknowledgement that never came. But there was something else beneath these patterns, something older. The anger Richard described in his dreams felt too ancient, too primal, to have originated in this lifetime. During our 5th session, I noticed Richard rubbing his left wrist unconsciously. When I asked about it, he seemed surprised. "I've always done that," he said, looking down at his hand. "I don't even realize I'm doing it. My mother used to point it out when I was a kid. Is there anything different about that wrist? An injury? Sensitivity? No, nothing physical. But ... He hesitated. "This is going to sound strange. Sometimes when I touch that spot, I feel a flash of something. Like a memory that isn't mine. Cold, metal, pressure, and darkness." It was at this point that I raised the possibility of regression therapy. "I'm not sure what I believe about past lives," Richard admitted. "I'm an analyst. I deal in data, in evidence, but I can't explain what I'm feeling, and I need to understand. Regression isn't about proving anything," I told him. "It's about accessing parts of the psyche that conventional therapy can't reach. Whatever we find, whether you interpret it as metaphor, genetic memory, or something else entirely, the goal is understanding." Richard nodded slowly. "Then let's do it. Because right now, I'm smiling at the fact that my father erased me from his legacy. And that smile is the strangest thing I've ever felt." We scheduled a regression for the following week, and I have to be honest, I didn't know what to expect. Cases involving family rejection often reveal childhood trauma or inherited emotional patterns, but something about Richard's peaceful acceptance of his disinheritance suggested we were dealing with something far older. The day of the regression, Richard arrived early. He seemed calmer than usual, almost resigned. "Whatever we find," he said, "I'm ready." I guided him through the initial relaxation process, breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, a gentle deepening of awareness. Richard was an excellent subject. His analytical mind, rather than resisting the process, seemed to embrace it as an experiment worth conducting fully. "I want you to imagine yourself walking down a long staircase," I said. "With each step, you're going deeper into your own consciousness, deeper into memory. Let the present fall away. Let time become fluid." His breathing slowed, his face relaxed. And then, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed. I'm somewhere cold, he whispered. Stone walls, damp. I can hear water dripping somewhere. Can you see anything? Not much. There's a small window above me, moonlight coming through. Iron bars. His hand moved unconsciously to his left wrist. I'm chained, both wrists, to the wall. Do you know where you are? A long pause. England, I think. I think it's England. Old. Very old. What year? Richard's brow furrowed 16:1642 or 43. The war. There's a war happening. His body had tensed on the therapy couch. Whatever he was experiencing, it was vivid enough to trigger physical responses. Who are you in this place? My name is Thomas. Thomas Ashworth. His voice had changed slightly deeper, with a cadence that didn't quite match his modern speech patterns. I was a merchant, wool, mostly, and cloth. I had a good trade, a family, a daughter. Tell me about your daughter. The tension in his face softened momentarily. Margaret, she's the light of my life. 12 years old. Clever as anyone I've ever known. She should have been born a son, would have been a scholar, but she reads everything she can find. I buy her books in secret. Why in secret? My wife doesn't approve. Says it gives girls ideas above their station. But I cannot deny Margaret anything. A shadow crossed his face. I could not deny her. Something happened to Margaret. Richard Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. I had a brother, Edmund, older by 3 years. When our father died, he inherited everything. The land, the house. I received nothing, not even a token. Father always favored him, called me the disappointment. The second son, who should have been content to live in Edmund's shadow. How did that make you feel? I was angry, furious, but I channeled that fury into building my own fortune. I became more successful than Edmund ever was. My wool trade flourished, while his farm struggled, and I married well. My wife brought a small dowry, but more importantly, she brought connections. Within 10 years, I had more wealth than my brother had ever possessed, and Margaret, Thomas's expression darkened. Edmund had a son, Gerald, a cruel boy who became a crueler man. When Margaret was 12 and Gerald was 19, Edmund came to me with a proposal, an alliance between our families. Margaret would marry Gerald when she came of age. The muscles in Richard's jaw tightened. I refused. I knew what Gerald was. I had seen him beat horses until they bled, heard rumors of servant girls who left Edmund's estate with bruises they couldn't explain. I would not give my daughter to that monster. What happened when you refused? Thomas's breathing quickened. Edmund smiled. That same smile our father used to wear when he was about to deny me something. And he said, "Brother, you have no choice. I've already spoken to the magistrate. Your loyalties in this war have been ... questioned. Certain documents have come to light. Papers that suggest you've been trading with the enemy. Were you? No, but it didn't matter. The papers were forged. Edmund had connections I didn't, and in wartime, accusations are enough. I was arrested that night, dragged from my home while Margaret screamed and my wife wept. Richard's left hand was now gripping his right wrist tightly, the same unconscious gesture. I had noticed in our earlier sessions, they put me here, in this cellar, these chains, and Edmund came to visit me the next day. He stood right there. Thomas's eyes moved, tracking something in the memory. He stood by the door and told me that the trial would happen in 3 days, that I would be found guilty, that my assets would be seized, and that Margaret would marry Gerald whether I approved or not. What did you say I begged? I, who had never begged for anything in my life, I pleaded with him to spare Margaret, take everything else, the money, the business, even my life if he needed to maintain the lie, but leave my daughter free. And Edmund's response, Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He laughed. He said, "This is what happens to second sons who forget their place. Father knew you would never amount to anything, and now everyone will know it too." The regression had reached a critical point. Thomas Richard was experiencing the memory with full emotional intensity. What happened next? I asked gently. The trial was a mockery. Edmund's witnesses, Edmund's magistrate, Edmund's verdict, guilty of treason, sentenced to death by hanging. Thomas's voice was hollow now, but Edmund wasn't finished. He made sure I knew, before they took me to the gallows, that Margaret had been married to Gerald that very morning, that she had screamed and fought and had to be held down while they forced her to speak the vows. Thomas, I'm so sorry I died with her screams in my ears, not the memory of them, the actual sound. Because Edmund had arranged for Margaret to be brought to the prison the morning of my execution. Gerald held her by the arm while she sobbed and called for me. And Edmund stood behind them both, smiling. That same smile. Richard's eyes snapped open. He was breathing hard, his face pale and sheeted with sweat. It was him, he said. My father, William Palmer. He had the same smile, the same way of making you feel worthless without ever raising his voice, the same cold satisfaction when he had power over you. He sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair. I spent my whole life feeling like I was waiting for something, waiting in darkness. And now I understand. I was waiting for justice that never came. Thomas Ashworth died in chains, watching his daughter be given to a monster, and some part of me has been in that cellar ever since, but we weren't finished. The connection between Thomas and Richard was clear, but there was still the question of the disinheritance. Why had being excluded from William's will felt like liberation rather than another injury? I want to go back, Richard said. I need to see more. In the second phase of the regression, we explored what happened after Thomas's execution. Margaret, Thomas said, his voice heavy with grief. I need to know what happened to Margaret. I guided him forward in that lifetime, past the moment of death, into what he could perceive from beyond. I can see her, he whispered. Years later, she's older now, 25, maybe 30. She's thin, too thin. There are scars on her arms that she keeps covered. Is Gerald still alive? No. He died in the war, a battle somewhere. Margaret received word 3 years after my execution. Thomas's expression shifted, becoming something close to pride. She was free, and she used that freedom. She found the forged documents that Edmund had used to condemn me. She found witnesses willing to speak the truth, and she brought a case before the new government after the war ended. What happened? Edmund was exposed, not just for what he did to me, but for other crimes. Stolen land, bribed officials, tenant farmers he had dispossessed. Margaret stood before the tribunal and spoke for 2 hours. She was brilliant, everything I had dreamed she could be. And Edmund Thomas's voice was cold, stripped of his lands, his title, his fortune. Everything he had stolen was taken away. He died in poverty alone. 3 years later, and Margaret lived to be 74. She never remarried. She used the wealth she recovered to establish a school for girls in our village. A place where they could learn to read, to think, to be more than what the world expected of them. There were tears on Richard's cheeks when he emerged from this part of the regression. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of something I rarely see in my practice: resolution. Thomas never saw justice in his lifetime, Richard said slowly. He died believing Edmund had won, believing Margaret would suffer forever. But she didn't. She survived. She fought, and she dismantled everything Edmund had built. How does this connect to your father? I asked. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he began to smile, the same peaceful smile he had worn when he first walked into my office. William, my father, in this life he was Edmund, not metaphorically. The same soul, the same patterns, the same need to control, to diminish, to make others feel small. And his will, excluding me completely, giving everything to Helen and her children. That was Edmund's final move. One last attempt to prove that I was nothing, that I would always be nothing. But it didn't work. No, because I'm not Thomas anymore. Thomas died in chains, believing he had failed. But I've lived a different life. I built my own success, just like Thomas did, but this time, no one could take it away with forged documents. And when I sat in that lawyer's office, when I heard that my father had given me nothing, Richard's smile widened. I realized that he had nothing I wanted. The house in Connecticut, I have my own home. The investments, I've built my own portfolio. The business, I have my own career. William spent his entire life trying to make me feel like I was worthless without his approval. And in that moment, I finally understood that I never needed it. The relief you felt was Thomas finally understanding that Edmund's power was an illusion. That everything Edmund stole, Margaret took back. That the chains weren't real. They were never real. I've been carrying the weight of that cellar for 400 years, Dr. Marchetti, and in the moment William tried to erase me one final time, I finally set it down. In the weeks following the regression, Richard began researching the historical details that had emerged during our sessions. He called me 3 weeks later, his voice vibrating with barely contained emotion. I found them, he said, Thomas and Margaret Ashworth. They were real. He had discovered parish records from a village in Yorkshire. Thomas Ashworth, wool merchant, executed for treason in 1643. His daughter, Margaret Ashworth, later Margaret Ashworth Croce, had apparently taken a hyphenated name after her legal victory had indeed established a school for girls. In 1668, the school had operated for nearly a century before eventually closing. There's more, Richard continued. Edmund Ashworth. He was stripped of his lands in 1651. There are court records. The testimony against him came primarily from his niece. It's all there. Everything I saw in the regression. But the detail that affected Richard most deeply was something he found almost by accident. I was looking through property records, he said, trying to trace what happened to the family estates, and I found something strange. The land that Edmund lost, the land that Margaret helped seize it, was eventually sold, generations later, to a family called Palmer. My family, Dr. Marchetti. I'm a direct descendant of someone who benefited from Margaret's victory. The justice she won didn't just free her soul. It eventually created the circumstances for my existence. There was one more revelation waiting for Richard. During a follow-up session, I asked him about his stepmother, Helen. Something about her has always bothered me, he admitted. Beyond the obvious, there's a quality to her that I could never quite name, a kind of hunger. Not for money, exactly. Something else. Do you want to explore this in regression? Richard nodded. What we found was not what either of us expected. In this session, Richard returned to the lifetime as Thomas Ashworth, but he saw something he had missed before. A woman standing beside Edmund during Thomas's trial. Not Edmund's wife's, someone else. A figure who watched the proceedings with particular intensity. She's enjoying this, Thomas whispered. Not just watching, savoring. She keeps looking at me like she knows me, like she's been waiting for this moment. Who is she? Edmund's. I think she's Edmund's mistress, but that's not right. There's something else, something I'm not seeing. I guided him to look more closely, and then his face went pale. The forged documents? The ones that condemned me, she made them. She's the one who created the evidence. Edmund gave the orders, but she did the work. She was a clerk's daughter. She knew how to mimic handwriting, how to age paper, how to create a lie that would hold up in court. Why would she help Edmund destroy you? Thomas's expression twisted with sudden understanding. Because I rejected her years ago, before I married my wife. She came to me with a proposal. A business arrangement that would have benefited her family. I could see what she really wanted: access to my growing wealth, my connections. I refused. I saw the calculation behind her eyes, and it made me uneasy. She smiled when I rejected her, that same hungry smile, and she said, "You'll regret this, Thomas Ashworth. Perhaps not today, perhaps not for years, but eventually you'll understand that I always collect what I'm owed." Richard emerged from the regression with a new understanding. Helen, he said, my stepmother. She has that same quality, that patience, that willingness to wait decades for what she wants. I remember when she first started seeing my father, I was maybe 10 years old. She looked at me once, just once with something in her eyes that I couldn't understand. Now, I do. It was recognition and anticipation. You believe Helen is connected to the woman from Thomas's life. I believe patterns repeat until they're resolved. That woman helped destroy Thomas. Helen spent 20 years positioning herself to inherit everything my father had. Both of them knew how to play the long game. Both of them were willing to wait years for their moment. He paused, considering. But here's the difference. When Thomas was destroyed, he died believing Edmund and that woman had won. He died in despair. When William's will was read, when Helen finally got everything she had been waiting for, I smiled. I walked out of that lawyer's office and felt the chains fall away. Whatever karma connected us, whatever debt was carried across for centuries, I paid it by refusing to be devastated, by being free anyway. Richard continued therapy for several more months, but the work shifted after the regression. We were no longer trying to understand his unusual reaction to disinheritance. We were integrating the insights he had gained and helping him build a new relationship with his own history. He told me something during one of our final sessions that has stayed with me. I used to think my father's rejection was a wound I had to heal, that the goal of therapy was to stop hurting. But now I understand that the hurt was never really about William. It was about Thomas. It was about dying in chains, believing my daughter would suffer forever, believing my brother had finally won. And now I know that Margaret won. That everything Edmund stole was eventually returned. That the school she built educated hundreds of girls over nearly a century. Thomas's legacy wasn't destruction, it was the courage Margaret found because of what she witnessed. She saw her father die for refusing to surrender her to cruelty, and she spent the rest of her life refusing to surrender to anything. Richard smiled, that peaceful smile that had so confused me when he first walked into my office. William's will was the universe giving me a chance to respond differently. Edmund took everything from Thomas. William tried to do the same to me. But I'm not chained to a cellar wall anymore. I'm not waiting for justice that will never come. I'm standing in the sunlight, and the prison only exists if I choose to stay in it. 6 months after our final session, I received a letter from Richard. He had done something unexpected with his newfound freedom. Using the research he had conducted into the Ashworth family history, he had located the village in Yorkshire where Margaret's school had once stood. The building was gone, demolished centuries ago, but the land remained. Richard had purchased it. I'm establishing a scholarship fund, he wrote, for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to pursue education. It won't be a physical school. Those exist everywhere now. Instead, it will be financial support for girls who have the intelligence and drive, but not the resources. I'm calling it the Margaret Ashworth Foundation. He included a photograph of himself standing on the property of Greenfield in the English countryside. Nothing remarkable to look at, but Richard's expression in that photograph told a different story. He looked like a man who had finally come home. The letter ended with a postscript that made me set down the paper and sit quietly for several minutes. You asked me once why being disinherited felt like liberation. I've been thinking about that question for months, and I finally have an answer. Freedom isn't the absence of chains. Freedom is the moment you realize the chains were never locked. Thomas spent his last moments believing he was powerless. I spent 47 years believing the same thing. But Margaret knew the truth. The only power others have over us is the power we give them. William gave me nothing in his will, but he gave me something far more valuable without meaning to. He gave me the chance to prove that I never needed anything from him at all, and that Dr. Marchetti is the only inheritance worth receiving. After all these years, after all these cases, I still think about Richard Palmer and the smile he wore when he learned he had been erased from his father's legacy. Most people would have fought, contested the will, hired lawyers, demanded recognition. Richard smiled because he understood something most of us spend our entire lives failing to grasp. The people who try to diminish us only succeed if we agree to be diminished. Thomas Ashworth died believing Edmund had won, but Thomas was wrong. Edmund won nothing. The land he stole was eventually seized. The fortune he accumulated was stripped away. The legacy he tried to build collapsed within a generation. And Margaret, the daughter Edmund tried to destroy, became the one whose name is still remembered, whose courage still echoes through the choices of her descendants. 400 years later, Richard sat in a lawyer's office and watched his father attempt the same cruelty. And this time, the pattern broke. Not through revenge, not through litigation, simply through the quiet, profound refusal to be wounded by someone else's smallness. Some people spend lifetimes carrying chains that were never locked. They wait in darkness for permission that no one has the authority to give. They measure their worth by the approval of people who were never capable of seeing them clearly. Richard Palmer walked into my office smiling because, in the moment of his greatest apparent defeat, he had finally set down the weight of centuries. And sometimes I wonder how many of us are carrying chains from lives we don't remember. How many of us are waiting in darkness for someone to unlock a door that was never truly closed? The answer, perhaps, is simpler than we imagine. The cellar is empty, the chains are rusted through, and the door at the top of the stairs has been open all along. We just have to be willing to walk through it. If this story resonated with something in your own life, if you've ever felt unexplained reactions to rejection, or found strange peace in moments that should have been painful, I'd like to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments, because the more we understand about these patterns, the more we understand about ourselves. And if you want to explore more cases from the Regression Files, subscribe. There are more stories waiting to be told. Stories about the memories we carry and the freedom we're all capable of finding. Until next time. Contagem de palavras. 5.127 palavras. O roteiro atual está com 5.127 palavras. Preciso expandir para atingir o mínimo de 7.000 palavras. Continuando a expansão. Expansão do roteiro. I should tell you something about what happened after Richard sent me that letter, because the story didn't end there. Stories like this rarely end where we expect them to. About 8 months after our final session, Richard called me unexpectedly. His voice was different, not the calm, measured tone I had grown accustomed to. There was urgency in it, excitement, perhaps, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Dr. Marchetti, I need to see you. Not for therapy. Something has happened, and I think you'll want to hear about it. We met for coffee at a small cafe near my office. Richard looked well, better than well. There was a vitality about him that I hadn't seen during our sessions. But there was also something else in his expression, a kind of wonder that you don't often see in a 48-year-old financial analyst. I went to Yorkshire, he said without preamble, last month, to finalize the paperwork for the foundation. While I was there, I decided to do some more research. Not looking for anything in particular, just curious. He pulled out a worn manila folder and set it on the table between us. I found the cord. Records from Margaret's tribunal, the actual documents. The local historical society had preserved them. They let me photograph everything. I opened the folder. Inside were printed photographs of handwritten documents, faded, water-stained in places, but still legible. The script was archaic, the spelling inconsistent, but the content was unmistakable. This is Margaret's testimony, Richard said, pointing to one particular document. She spoke for 2 hours. Every word was recorded by a court scribe. I scanned the pages. The language was formal, the structure methodical. Margaret Ashworth had presented her case with the precision of a trained lawyer, remarkable for any person in the 17th century. Extraordinary for a woman in an era when female voices were routinely dismissed. Look at this part, Richard said, turning to a specific page. I read the passage he indicated. My father, Thomas Ashworth, was a man of honor who sought nothing but to protect his family and conduct his trade with integrity. He was condemned not by evidence, but by fabrication, not by witnesses, but by purchased lies. My uncle Edmund Ashworth, in his greed and malice, destroyed a good man to steal what he could not earn. I stand before this tribunal, not for vengeance, but for truth. For if we allow the powerful to erase the innocent through false witness, then no one is safe. Not my father's memory. Not my children. Not any of us. Richard was watching my face as I read. She was 28 when she gave this testimony. He said, 28 years old, a widow, standing before a tribunal of men who had every reason to dismiss her, and she won, not through anger, not through tears, through meticulous preparation and unflinching clarity. This is remarkable, I said. There's more. Richard turned to another page. After Edmund was stripped of his lands, there was a final hearing to determine how the seized assets would be distributed. Margaret was asked what she wanted. The court was prepared to award her substantial compensation. After all, her father's entire estate had been stolen. Do you know what she requested? I shook my head. Nothing for herself. She asked that her father's business, the wool trade he had built, be re-established in the village, with the profits used to employ local families who had suffered during the war. She asked that a portion of Edmund's seized wealth be used to create the school she would later build. And she asked for one more thing. Richard's voice softened. She asked that her father's name be formally cleared, that the court issue a declaration stating Thomas Ashworth had been falsely accused and wrongfully executed, that his grave Markowitz had been left blank because traitors were denied named, burials be replaced with a proper headstone. Did they grant her requests? Every single one. The declaration clearing Thomas Ashworth's name is still in the Yorkshire archives. I've seen it. I've touched the paper. Richard was quiet for a moment, looking down at the photographs. But here's the part that made me call you, the part I still can't fully explain. He pulled out one final photograph. It showed a gravestone, weathered, moss-covered, but still standing in what appeared to be a small churchyard, Margaret's grave. She's buried next to her father. Their stones have stood together for over 350 years. He pointed to the inscription on Margaret's stone. The photograph was slightly blurry, but I could make out the words. Margaret Ashworth, Cross 163-11705, daughter of Thomas, who turned sorrow into learning and injustice into legacy. That's beautiful, I said. Read her father's stone. I looked at the adjacent photograph. The inscription on Thomas Ashworth's replacement headstone read, Thomas Ashworth, 159-816-43 WOAO-L, merchant and loving father, wrongfully taken, righteously remembered. The chains were never locked. I looked up at Richard. His eyes were glistening. I never told anyone that phrase, he said quietly. Not before the regression, not during it. You asked me to describe what I felt when William's will was read, and I talked about feeling free, about setting down a weight, but I never used those exact words. The chains were never locked. You said something similar, I recalled. In one of our follow-up sessions, after the regression? Yes, but that phrase on Thomas's gravestone was carved in 2 years after Margaret won her case, 8 years after Thomas died. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. How did Margaret know? How did she choose those exact words to put on her father's grave? Unless, ... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I've spent my career studying the phenomenon of past life regression. I've seen hundreds of cases where patients access information they couldn't possibly have known through conventional means. Names, dates, historical details that are later verified through research. Each time, I'm reminded of how little we truly understand about memory, consciousness, and the connections that persist across time. But this case, Richard's case, went beyond the usual verification of historical facts. This was something else entirely. A phrase that existed in Thomas's grave for 3.5 centuries. A phrase that Richard spoke in my office before he had ever traveled to Yorkshire. Before he had seen the court records. Before he knew that gravestone existed. Perhaps there's a rational explanation. Perhaps Richard had encountered that inscription somewhere in his childhood history book. A passing reference, and stored it unconsciously, only to retrieve it during regression. The human mind is capable of extraordinary feats of hidden memory, but perhaps the explanation is simpler. Perhaps Thomas Ashworth, in the moments after his death, understood something about his imprisonment that he hadn't grasped while living. Perhaps he whispered that understanding to his daughter in whatever way the dead can whisper to the living. And perhaps Margaret, in her profound love for her father, chose to carve his final wisdom into stone so that it might survive the centuries. So that, one day, a man named Richard Palmer might read those words and finally understand why being disinherited felt like liberation. I've included this postscript in Richard's case file because I believe it matters. Not as proof of anything, I'm not in the business of proving the unprovable, but as evidence that the patterns we discover in regression are not merely metaphor. They are not simply the mind's way of processing present trauma through historical costume. They are something more. Something we don't have adequate words for yet. Richard Palmer came to me because he smiled when he should have been devastated. He came seeking to understand an emotion that didn't fit the circumstances. And what he found was a story for centuries old, a story of betrayal and injustice and, ultimately, of love that refused to be extinguished. Margaret Ashworth never forgot her father. She built her entire life around honoring his memory and proving his innocence. And in doing so, she created ripples that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Ripples that eventually reached a lawyer's office in Connecticut, where a man learned he had been written out of his father's will and felt, for the first time in his life, truly free. Some would call this coincidence. Some would call it imagination. Some would call it the elaborate construction of a mind seeking meaning in meaningless circumstances. I'd call it the regression files. And I've learned, after all these years, not to mistake my inability to explain something for evidence that it isn't real. The chains were never locked. Thomas knew it, Margaret knew it, and now Richard knows it too, which leaves only one question. What chains are you carrying that were never truly locked? This case taught me something about the nature of freedom. If this story resonated with something in your own life, if you've ever felt unexplained peace in moments that should have been painful, or carried weight you couldn't explain, I'd like to hear about it. Share your experience in the comments, because the more we understand about these patterns, the more we understand about ourselves. And if you want to explore more cases from the regression files, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories waiting to be told.